It's Powers of X, number 4. Oh, some people are saying it's gone off the rails. Let's let's talk about that. Hey there, this is Perch. It's Powers of X, which is issue number 4. So this is 8 issues in. So this is officially the two thirds of the way through the Hickman X-Men reboot. And I before we dive into this, I think there's a saying that says "strange gives and strange takes," and I think that's kind of how you have to look at this issue, because Hickman has been doing a lot to do some world building, change your expectations. You know, the classic subvert your expectations of how characters are, how they behave, where they go. And a lot of people are loving kind of the various takes. We've got Apocalypse acting very kind of out of character, Xavier out of character, and yet, you know, some of the characters are pitch perfect. The way Cyclops is written, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, kind of those descriptions. But here we're going to get the reintroduction of Mr. Sinister, and that one we're going to subvert expectations again. And for some, we've gone in the wrong direction. But let's dive into the issue. We start with an interesting quote. "I fear our needs will far outlast our desires. We have many hard choices ahead of us." That first sentence is pretty interesting, but let's go into the issue. So once again, it's Jonathan Hickman, R.B. Silva, Marta Garcia, the colorist, Clayton Cowles, the letterer, always very good. And we're back in this Powers of X timeline, which does the year 1, year 10, year 100, which we know this timeline is, well, we don't know this timeline, but we believe this timeline has been destroyed. It's the mini lives of Moira, so we're not totally ever sure where we are. But what we're getting here in year 1 is the first meeting of Magneto and Xavier with Mr. Sinister in this timeline. Now, let's just assume for the moment that Powers of X is a little bit more linear, and this is the Moira joins up with Apocalypse timeline, which is just a lot of characters behaving differently. And so far before they normally did in X-Men continuity, thus year 1, Xavier and Magneto are going to meet Mr. Sinister. And what's happened here is, without Xavier doing his initial X-Men and doing a lot of the work he did in the timeline we all know for the last 60 years or so, he instead has been diverted with Magneto to kind of join up and figure out kind of a different way of doing things via Son of Moira's influence. So, assuming that's still the timeline, that's what we're talking about here, then this means that this Mr. Sinister did not go down the path of the Marauders and do a lot of the things he did in this timeline, which made him more of a kind of a loner, more of a more of a sinister Mr. Sinister, if you will. This Mr. Sinister in this timeline is more aligned to Kieran Gillian's the City of Sinister, where you had Mr. Sinister cloned himself and in the process gone a bit crazy. And here we see that, you know, unabated, he's done this, he's formed, Sinister Island or what have you, and he's lost his mind. And so as Xavier and Magneto meet with Sinister, it becomes very clear that that this is a very different Mr. Sinister, this very different kind of realm of a crazed Mr. Sinister. This isn't the one we were used to. This isn't a reimagining of the one we're used to. This is a different timeline. And this is a timeline where Sinister's kind of cloning and genetic manipulations ran amok, and he lost control in his mind. So anyway, they go in, we get a very odd kind of Mr. Sinister. We see some of kind of the craziness of his court, and we see them kind of approach Mr. Sinister with a offer, basically, that Xavier and Magneto are going to give them their DNA and many others that they know, which is an amazing offer to the Sinister we know. This Sinister's not interested, but he's immediately executed by another who, again, is acting very weird. You know, my mutant powers overthrowing tyrants and being absolutely fabulous. And it's just, it's again, this is crazy town Sinister. And Xavier does I need you to begin the good work, and then I need you to forget why you're doing it and that we were ever here until the day I tell you to remember. That's significant. So then we get the red diamond, we get some kind of more things with Sinister, lies and Sinister secrets. Um, Anyway, just some kind of it's odd because everything in the Hickman run has been very serious, very direct, very ominous, and this seems almost lighthearted. I would counter that by saying what you're seeing is not lighthearted at all. It's a trick. We're seeing a crazy Mr. Sinister. We're seeing a timeline where very different things have happened to him, and as a result, he's gone amok, but he's clearly going to influence and break parts of the X-Men's future, which we've seen in previous issues. It talks about Sinister cloning and how he betrayed the mutants and he wasn't to be trusted and it caused a problem. So I think it looks all happy funny, but this is the Mr. Sinister that caused huge damage and was a major threat to the X-Men, in part because he's cloned himself and lost his mind. So that was our first. And then we get, months ago where we're seeing Doug Ramsey and Professor X kind of investigating Krakoa, and Doug wants to speak to him, and we're seeing kind of Doug do things that Xavier can't in terms of interfacing and talking, and we're seeing this interesting kind of hand with a sword and kind of the mythology of Krakoa and Okara and the fact that they became two, and then Apocalypse who came in and sort of saved everything, um, and how they became alone, and just kind of an interesting reimagining of Apocalypse and his four horsemen and kind of what happened and how Apocalypse was one of the saviors, kind of a good guy in the early time. That's interesting too. The world would have fallen if not for Apocalypse. This is bringing interesting things in about him as well, which leads to the Apocalypse we know from much later in the timeline. So Doug is kind of brought in on the plan, and he is going to start to work with it. And we're talking about the caretakers of Krakoa, which include Doug Ramsey, Sage, Black Tom, Trinary, and Beast, which is an amazing, interesting assembly. It's cool that they're finding actual use for Trinary, a character that sure seemed like was going to get dumped onto the forgotten, side of the road of history, so to speak. And then finally, this is an issue in 3 arcs. We get the final one, which is Year 1000. And this is kind of continuing on with the story we've been hearing about the ascension into the Falnax and how, in some ways, it kind of tricked the Falnax in finding a new way to continue with life, where human biology does not work with the Falnax. So they have found a way to kind of record or copy the Falnax is going to consume everything. So they found a way to copy their identity and their humanity into a form that could be absorbed. And now we see if it's acceptable. So it's an interesting 3 things. This is an issue I think that's important to happen, and I'll explain why in a minute. But we end with a quote: "I'm not afraid of what I've done, but I do fear what it will one day cost." And that could refer to the deal with Mr. Sinister. It could refer to some things that we've been seeing all along about how the X-Men were assembled and kind of what's been done. Are we seeing clones of the X-Men all this time? Is the X-Men book going to start with Cyclops and the survivors kind of running for their lives against an Xavier gone amok? I mean, who knows what we're doing here? But this is the prelude to the last 4 issues, which are going to be very, very impactful. So the next issue, House of X number 5, next week. This issue is marked red. The last one that was marked red was the big reveal about Moira and her timeline. So we're expecting some massive things to happen there. And then we get a Powers of X, House of X, and then finally Powers of X number 6. So only 4 more issues left. A lot to tie up, a lot to connect us from here to there. Is this 12-issue series nothing more than kind of a glimpse in alternate reality, a new kind of Days of Future Past big storyline before we just go back to just the X-Men? One thing Hickman has said is that his core X-Men book will be all standalone issues, that he's not going to have storylines continue from one to another. So that's very jarring if you think about it, going from a very tight 12-issue interconnected storyline into just one-off issues. That's, again, not, he's subverting my expectations. But it's interesting to see where that's all going. So a lot of people were bothered by the Mr. Sinister rendition and kind of what was going on there. I just asked people to remember 2 things. One, alternate timeline, that's key. And two, we're seeing kind of a world in which things happen differently. And the lead up to this makes a lot of sense of just how cloning has gone wrong, how Mr. Sinister is thinking, and how this kind of insane, almost doofus kind of character is going to majorly impact the X-Men. I think we are going to see Sinister play a role in these last four issues. I think the final one, Powers of X number 6, I think is going to be a big Sinister issue. Just a guess. I think next week is going to be the bigger, an even bigger reveal than what we learned from with Moira. And I think that this last third is going to be a lot of Sinister and cloning and what Xavier's been up to, and kind of pulling back the curtain to suggest that everything we've seen is not what we thought in new ways. So I thought it was a good issue. I think it's we're doing a lot of different things. We're still continuing to kind of lay out this jarring, unsafe, got to talk about it kind of mythology, and that's where we're going. It's when the X-Men were strongest. So I think bear with it. Don't take it so seriously. I don't think this is a case of let's reimagine Mr. Sinister and just make him flaming. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think we're seeing a logical different outcome of inbreeding and cloning, and I think that it's lulling you into a bit of a false sense of security before next week's sucker punch of an issue. So that's what I thought. What do you think? Leave me a comment in the comments below. Like, subscribe, tell a friend. Follow me on Twitter, Comic Perch, and thanks for listening.